At 72, Nolan Lane had already lost his home, his savings, and the son he once trusted with everything. So when he and his 69-year-old wife Maria bought the burned remains of Bellweather Mansion for $18, the auction hall erupted in laughter. The mansion had no roof, no electricity, and walls blackened by a fire no one in Hollow Creek wanted to discuss. That first night, while rain slipped through the ruined ceiling, Nolan heard a deep metallic groan beneath the great hall. Maria grabbed his arm as the floor trembled. Then, through decades of ash, two enormous stone slabs slowly pulled apart. A staircase appeared below them, and from the darkness came a sound neither of them could explain. Stay with Nolan and Maria, because what waited beneath that mansion would expose a buried crime and give two broken people one final chance to rise. The morning Nolan Lane signed the papers that would eventually cost him everything began like any other morning in Baltimore. Sunlight filtered through the lace curtains Maria had sewn more than 30 years earlier. The old kettle whistled softly on the stove, filling their modest kitchen with the familiar scent of coffee. Their brick row house was small, but every corner carried a memory. The worn oak dining table still bore faint scratches from Daniel's childhood science projects. The hallway wall displayed faded family photographs taken over 4 decades' birthday parties, graduations, camping trips, and Christmas mornings that seemed impossibly distant now. Nolan often believed that a home was more than wood and brick. It was proof that ordinary people could build something lasting through patience and sacrifice. He had spent 42 years working as a municipal electrician. Through freezing winters and blistering summers, he climbed utility poles, repaired aging electrical systems, and answered emergency calls while most families slept peacefully. Every overtime shift, every missed holiday, every aching muscle had served one purpose. He wanted Maria to grow old without ever worrying about where she would sleep. Maria had built her own quiet legacy. As a public school librarian, she believed every child deserved to feel important. She remembered thousands of names, recommended books that changed lives, and often spent her own money replacing damaged library copies so children would never feel ashamed. Neither of them had earned great wealth, but together they had created something they believed could never be taken away. Security? That illusion ended when Daniel knocked on their front door. Their only son looked exhausted. Dark circles hung beneath his eyes, and the confidence that had once made him the most ambitious young contractor in his neighborhood seemed to have vanished. Maria embraced him immediately. "You haven't been eating properly," she said gently. Daniel forced a smile. "I've just been busy." Nolan noticed something different. Daniel rarely looked either parent directly in the eyes. Throughout breakfast, conversation felt strangely forced. Daniel complimented Maria's cooking, asked about Nolan's garden, laughed at old stories, yet his fingers never stopped tapping nervously against the coffee mug. Finally, he inhaled deeply. "Dad, Mom, I need your help." The words instantly changed the room. Daniel explained that his construction company had secured an enormous commercial contract. Completing the project would transform his business forever. Unfortunately, unexpected material costs had created temporary cash flow problems. "Bank believes in the project," Daniel assured them. "They only need additional collateral until payments come through." Nolan listened quietly. "What kind of collateral?" Daniel hesitated only a moment. "The house." Silence settled over the kitchen. Maria slowly lowered her cup. "Our house?" "Only temporarily," Daniel replied quickly. 6 months at most. After that, the loan is paid off and everything goes back to normal." Maria exchanged a glance with Nolan. She had always trusted her instincts. Something felt wrong. "Can't the bank use your equipment?" she asked. "They already have." "What about your trucks?" "They're included." "The office?" Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "Already mortgaged." Each answer made Maria's concern grow stronger. "Nolan," she said carefully, Maybe we should speak with a lawyer before signing anything. Daniel's expression changed immediately. Mom, lawyers will only delay everything. It's a lot of paperwork. It's just standard business documents. He reached across the table. Dad, you've always taught me that family helps family. The sentence struck Nolan harder than Daniel realized. His own father had died before Nolan reached adulthood. Everything Nolan knew about responsibility had been learned through hardship, rather than guidance. He had promised himself his own son would never face life's struggles alone. If Daniel needed help, wasn't helping exactly what fathers were supposed to do? Maria watched her husband's face soften. She knew that expression. Nolan had already begun convincing himself. Later that afternoon, they visited the bank. The conference room looked elegant, filled with polished wood furniture and framed certificates. Stacks of documents covered the table. The loan officer explained the paperwork in calm, practiced language. Daniel nodded confidently after every paragraph. Nolan read what he could, but the legal terminology seemed endless. Several pages required signatures. Others required initials. Daniel occasionally pointed toward highlighted sections. This is just acknowledging the collateral. This confirms temporary responsibility. This one explains repayment schedules. Everything sounded routine. Maria remained uneasy. She noticed Daniel wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool air conditioning. Twice, she asked if they could take the documents home overnight. Twice, Daniel politely discouraged the idea. The project starts Monday. We're already behind schedule. We really can't lose another day. Nolan finally picked up the pen. He looked toward Maria. She didn't smile. She simply squeezed his hand. It wasn't approval, it was trust. If Nolan believed helping Daniel was the right thing to do, she would stand beside him. The signatures took less than 10 minutes. 42 years of sacrifice disappeared with a few strokes of blue ink. For the first several weeks, everything appeared normal. Daniel called often. He sounded optimistic. He spoke about progress investors and upcoming payments. Then the phone calls became shorter. Soon, they stopped entirely. Maria left voicemail after voicemail. None were returned. Nolan assumed Daniel had become overwhelmed with work. He'll call when things settle down, he kept saying. But his voice sounded less convincing each week. One rainy Tuesday, an unfamiliar envelope arrived. It carried the logo of a law firm. Maria opened it while Nolan watered flowers on the porch. Her hands began shaking before she reached the second page. Nolan. He stepped inside immediately. What happened? She silently handed him the documents. The loan had defaulted. Foreclosure proceedings had already begun. The bank intended to seize their house. There has to be some mistake, Nolan whispered. He called Daniel. No answer. Again. Straight to voicemail. Again. The number had been disconnected. For 3 days they searched desperately. They visited Daniel's office. The building stood empty. Neighbors explained moving trucks had arrived nearly 2 weeks earlier. His business partner had vanished. Equipment had been repossessed. Every trace of Daniel's company had disappeared. Only then did Nolan begin discovering the truth. Daniel hadn't been facing temporary financial trouble. His company had been drowning in debt for more than 2 years. Several previous loans had already gone unpaid. Subcontractors had filed lawsuits. Tax obligations had accumulated. Some financial information presented during the bank meeting had been incomplete. Other details had been intentionally concealed. Nolan sat alone at the kitchen table, long after midnight, surrounded by unopened bills and legal notices. He replayed every conversation with Daniel, every reassuring smile, every promise, every signature. I should have known, he murmured. Maria placed a blanket over his shoulders. You trusted your son? I failed you. No. I promised this house would always be yours. Maria knelt beside him. This isn't your shame, but I signed. You signed because you loved him. Tears filled Nolan's eyes. I was supposed to protect you. Maria rested her forehead against his. We protected each other for 40 years. One terrible decision doesn't erase a lifetime of love. Weeks later, sheriff's deputies arrived with the final foreclosure order. Neither officer behaved cruelly. In fact, both appeared genuinely uncomfortable. They quietly explained the legal process and apologized for circumstances beyond their control. Nolan loaded their belongings into an aging pickup truck borrowed from a neighbor. There wasn't room for much. A toolbox, 2 suitcases, Maria's favorite books, several family photographs. Everything else remained behind. Before closing the front door for the last time, Maria removed one small envelope from the kitchen drawer. She slipped it into her purse without saying anything. That evening, they checked into a temporary shelter. For the first time since their marriage, they no longer had a place to call home. Many residents avoided eye contact. Others quietly shared similar stories of illness, layoffs, divorce, or betrayal. Nolan barely spoke. Every morning he searched for work despite his age. Every evening he returned, looking more defeated. One afternoon, Maria noticed a county bulletin board near the shelter cafeteria. Among dozens of advertisements hung a faded auction notice for abandoned rural properties. Most listings had opening bids in the hundreds. One stood out. Bellweather Mansion, opening bid $18. She stared at the paper for several moments before pulling it down. What a ridiculous idea, she whispered. She crumpled it and threw it into a nearby trash bin. Hours later, while Maria prepared dinner with other shelter volunteers, Nolan quietly walked past the same bulletin board. He noticed the partially visible notice inside the trash. He unfolded it carefully. His tired eyes lingered on the photograph of a burned mansion standing alone beneath open skies. Something stirred inside him. It wasn't hope. Not yet. It was simply the feeling that perhaps losing everything also meant there was nothing left to fear. That evening, as Maria unpacked the few belongings they still owned, she opened the old library card envelope she had carried from their former home. Inside lay 18 carefully folded $1 bills. She smiled sadly. I saved this for Daniel's birthday. Nolan looked at the auction notice in his hands. Then he looked at the $18. For the first time in months, husband and wife saw the same impossible thought reflected in each other's eyes. Perhaps their last gift to the son who had abandoned them could become the first step toward building a future for themselves. 3 days later, before sunrise painted the Baltimore skyline with pale shades of gray, Nolan Lane tightened the final strap around the 2 worn suitcases resting in the bed of an aging pickup truck. The truck belonged to a former co-worker who refused to accept payment, insisting only that Nolan find somewhere worth calling home again. Neither Nolan nor Maria believed such a place still existed. Yet the folded auction deed lying inside Nolan's jacket pocket represented something they had not possessed in months. Ownership, not comfort, not safety, but a place where no landlord could ask them to leave the following morning. The drive to Hollow Creek took nearly 4 hours. As the city slowly disappeared behind them, highways gave way to narrow country roads, lined with dense forests, abandoned barns, and forgotten farms reclaimed by nature. Maria spent most of the trip looking through the passenger window. She wondered if she was mourning the home they had lost, or saying goodbye to the life she once expected. At 69, she had imagined retirement would be filled with gardening, afternoon coffee on the porch, and occasional visits from grandchildren. Instead, she was driving toward a burned mansion everyone else had refused to buy. She reached across the seat and gently squeezed Nolan's hand. You don't have to pretend you're not scared. Nolan smiled faintly. I wasn't pretending. She looked at him. I've never been more frightened. So have I. Neither of them spoke again for several miles. Sometimes honesty required no further explanation. Near noon, a weathered wooden sign appeared beside the road. Welcome to Hollow Creek, population 1842. The town looked frozen in another era. A single grocery store stood across from a small diner. An aging courthouse overlooked the town square. The streets were clean, but unusually quiet, as though everyone already knew everyone else's business. When Nolan stopped at a gas station to ask for directions, the elderly clerk immediately recognized the address. Bellweather Mansion. Nolan nodded. That's right. The clerk stared at him for several seconds. You bought that place? I did. The man slowly removed his glasses. I hope you're not planning on living there. We are. The clerk looked toward Maria before quietly shaking his head. I've lived here 50 years. No one stayed a full night in that house since the fire. Maria politely smiled. We've survived worse. The clerk didn't argue. Instead, he simply pointed toward the northern road. Follow the old orchard until the pavement ends. As Nolan pulled away, the clerk remained standing outside the station watching their truck disappear. The final mile consisted of cracked gravel surrounded by overgrown fields, wildflowers pushed through broken fences. Ancient oak trees stretched over the narrow road, casting shifting shadows across the windshield. Then the mansion appeared. Maria instinctively covered her mouth. The building was even more damaged than the auction photograph had suggested. Entire sections of the roof had collapsed decades earlier. Tall vines climbed blackened brick walls. Broken windows stared outward like empty eyes. The once grand front porch leaned dangerously to one side. A rusted iron gate hung from a single hinge. Nature had been patiently reclaiming the estate for nearly half a century. Nolan turned off the engine. Silence settled around them. Even the wind seemed reluctant to disturb the place. For several moments, neither of them moved. Finally, Nolan reached for Maria's hand. Ready. She looked at the ruined mansion once more. No, he smiled gently. Neither am I. Together they stepped through the broken gate. The front door no longer existed. Ash still stained sections of the entrance hall, despite decades of rain and changing seasons. Pieces of burned furniture remained scattered across warped wooden floors. Above them, open sky replaced what had once been an elegant ceiling. Yet beneath the destruction, traces of extraordinary craftsmanship remained. Hand-carved stair railings, imported stone columns, decorative fireplaces, intricate stained glass fragments glittering beneath layers of dust. Maria slowly turned in place. Someone loved this house. Nolan nodded. You can still feel it. As they carried their belongings inside, the sound of approaching vehicles echoed from the road. Within minutes, several pickup trucks stopped outside the property. Men and women climbed out, pretending to admire the scenery, while openly staring at the newcomers. Whispers spread quickly. So they're real. I heard they paid $18. They must be crazy. An older woman laughed loudly enough for everyone to hear. They'll be gone before the first frost. Another man pointed towards the unstable roof. If the weather doesn't kill them, the building will. Maria lowered her eyes. The laughter reminded her painfully of the shelter. People often mocked misfortune because it reassured them such tragedy could never happen to themselves. Nolan continued unloading their truck without responding. He had spent too many years repairing electrical failures to worry about opinions. Eventually, a polished black SUV approached the mansion. Unlike the others, its arrival immediately silenced the crowd. A tall man wearing an expensive tailored jacket stepped out confidently. His smile appeared practiced, rather than genuine. He extended his hand. You must be Mr. and Mrs. Lane. Nolan. The man shook his hand firmly. My name is Graham Foster. I chair the Hollow Creek Town Council. Maria noticed how everyone else seemed to watch Graham before speaking. His influence required no introduction. I understand congratulations are in order, Graham continued. You've purchased quite a unique property. We're grateful to have somewhere to start over, Nolan replied. Graham glanced toward the mansion. I imagine you've realized the restoration costs will exceed several $100,000. We'll repair what we can. You misunderstand, Graham smiled again. I'm here to save you unnecessary hardship. He removed an envelope from inside his jacket. I'll pay you $500 for the property today. Maria frowned. You want to buy it already? It's simply a business opportunity. You paid $18. I'm offering $500. That's a generous return. Nolan studied Graham carefully. If the place is worthless. He looked directly into Graham's eyes. Son, why are you so eager to own it? For the first time, Graham's smile weakened. I dislike seeing elderly people make expensive mistakes. We've already made our biggest mistake, Maria answered quietly. We're not interested in selling. Graham folded the envelope. You may change your minds. I don't think so. He looked around the burned estate once more. Everyone does. Without another word, he returned to his SUV and drove away. The spectators slowly dispersed, disappointed that the conversation had ended without drama. Only one figure remained near the roadside, a teenage boy carrying a sketchbook. He couldn't have been older than 18. Instead of staring at Nolan and Maria, he was carefully drawing the mansion. Nolan approached him. You like old buildings? The boy looked embarrassed. I'm sorry. I wasn't trying to bother you. You weren't. I'm Tyler Reed. Nolan. Tyler opened the sketchbook. Detailed pencil drawings filled nearly every page, different angles of Bellweather Mansion, old chimneys, window frames, garden walls, even architectural measurements. You've studied this place? Tyler nodded. My grandfather says I spend too much time here. What interests you? Tyler pointed toward the eastern side of the mansion. Old photographs show basement windows over there. Nolan looked where Tyler indicated. Solid stone foundation. No windows, only thick ivy. Maybe they were filled in. Tyler slowly shook his head. I don't think so. Why not? Because the stone doesn't match. Before Nolan could ask another question, an elderly voice shouted from the road. Tyler! A weathered pickup truck had stopped near the gate. An older man stepped out, his expression filled with unexpected anger. Get away from that house. Tyler sighed. My grandfather. Walter Reed walked quickly toward them. His eyes never left the mansion. He barely acknowledged Nolan or Maria. You shouldn't be here. Nolan remained calm. We own the property. Walter's face became noticeably paler. Then leave while you still can. Maria asked gently, Did something happen here? Walter looked toward the burned walls. For several long seconds he seemed unable to speak. Finally he whispered, Some places remember everything. Without another explanation, he turned back toward his truck. Tyler offered Nolan an apologetic smile before following him. As evening settled across Hollow Creek, Nolan and Maria explored the mansion room by room. Near the rear library, Maria discovered shelves that had partially survived the fire. Most books had turned to ash. One thick ledger remained trapped beneath fallen timber. Its leather cover had been badly burned. Carefully brushing away soot, she opened the fragile pages. Names, dates, entire families. Dozens became hundreds. Beside many entries appeared handwritten notes. Stayed 6 weeks. Children recovering. Winter shelter. Work found. Maria looked toward Nolan. This wasn't just someone's mansion. Nolan stepped beside her. No. It was helping people. As darkness covered the estate, they carefully placed the guest register inside their temporary sleeping area. Neither noticed the shadow watching from outside the broken library window. Long after they fell asleep, the silent figure slipped into the mansion. By sunrise, several pages from the guest register had disappeared. The first sunrise over Bellweather Mansion revealed just how impossible Nolan and Maria's task truly was. Golden light spilled across the scorched brick walls, exposing every crack the darkness had hidden. Rainwater collected inside collapsed rooms. Charred beams leaned against broken fireplaces. Weeds grew through fractured stone floors, as though nature had already decided the mansion belonged to the forest instead of people. Maria stood quietly on the front steps holding 2 steaming mugs of instant coffee, heated over a small camping stove. "I think this place looks even worse in daylight," she said with a tired smile. Nolan accepted the mug. "It also looks more honest." She raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean? Nothing here is pretending to be something it isn't." He looked around the ruined estate. "Neither are we anymore." For the first time since losing their home, Maria laughed. It was brief, but it was real. Their first priority was simple: find one room they could survive in before colder weather arrived. After inspecting every section of the mansion, Nolan selected the old servants' wing on the western side. Unlike the main hall, most of its stone walls remained standing. Part of the roof had survived. Several windows were broken, but the wooden frames could still be repaired. "It isn't much," Nolan said, "but it'll keep rain off our heads." Maria nodded. "It's enough." For the next several days, they worked from sunrise until evening. Nolan reinforced weakened beams using salvaged lumber collected from abandoned sheds nearby. He carefully removed unstable sections instead of forcing them to remain. Every nail he hammered seemed to erase a little of the helplessness that had followed him from Baltimore. He was building again, not for someone else's paycheck, for himself. Maria cleaned debris room by room. She scrubbed soot from stone walls, organized usable furniture, and washed every surviving dish she found buried beneath decades of dust. Even the smallest improvements lifted their spirits. A repaired window, a working wood stove, a dry corner where they could sleep. They were no longer merely surviving. They were creating a home. On the 4th afternoon, Nolan heard footsteps outside. Tyler Reed stood near the porch, carrying several weathered boards across his shoulder. "I found these behind an old barn," the teenager said nervously. "The owner said I could have them." Nolan examined the lumber. Despite its age, it remained solid. "These are excellent." Tyler smiled shyly. "I thought maybe you could use them." "You thought right?" Within minutes, Tyler was helping Nolan replace damaged floor joists. The teenager worked carefully, measuring twice before making every cut. His hands lacked experience, but his instincts impressed Nolan immediately. "Who taught you?" Nolan asked. "No one. I mostly learned from books." Nolan paused. "Books don't usually teach people to hold a saw that way." Tyler shrugged. "I watched repair crews whenever they worked around town." The answer made Nolan smile. Skill could be taught. Curiosity could not. By sunset, Tyler had become less like a visitor and more like an apprentice. Meanwhile, Maria walked into Hollow Creek for groceries. The town remained polite, but distant. People greeted her with cautious smiles before whispering once she passed. Inside the grocery store, conversations grew noticeably quieter. At the checkout counter, an elderly cashier finally spoke. "You're the lady living in Bellweather Mansion." Maria smiled gently. "My husband and I are trying." The cashier hesitated. "Most folks think you'll leave before winter." "We've heard." "Some are even taking bets." Maria remained silent. The cashier looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry," Maria simply answered. "People laughed when we moved into our first house, too." The woman blinked. "Why?" "Because it was tiny." She smiled softly. "They stopped laughing after we filled it with love." The cashier's expression warmed. As Maria packed her groceries, she realized something important. Not everyone in Hollow Creek wanted to see them fail. Many were simply afraid of standing apart from the crowd. The following morning, Maria visited the town library, hoping to learn more about Bellweather Mansion. The building was small, but beautifully preserved. Its shelves contained nearly 2 centuries of local newspapers. The librarian pointed her toward historical archives. "If you're researching Bellweather," she whispered, "give yourself plenty of time." Maria spent hours reading yellowed newspaper pages. She discovered Eleanor Bellweather had inherited the mansion nearly 50 years before the fire. Unlike many wealthy landowners, Eleanor quietly funded schools' free meal programs and emergency housing for struggling families. One article especially caught Maria's attention. It described a heated town council meeting. Eleanor had publicly opposed plans for a chemical processing facility proposed by Foster Industrial Holdings. The company's founder was Graham Foster's grandfather. According to the article, Eleanor argued the factory would poison local farmland and drinking water. Months later, Bellweather Mansion burned. Official reports blamed faulty electrical wiring. Maria carefully copied every article she found. That evening, she showed them to Nolan. He studied the old fire report. His brow slowly tightened. "This doesn't make sense." "What doesn't?" "The wiring." Maria looked confused. Nolan pointed toward a technical diagram. "They claim the fire started because overloaded electrical circuits spread flames throughout the house. And I've worked with electrical systems my entire life." "This description is wrong." He spread additional photographs across the table. "See these burn patterns?" Maria leaned closer. "They're separated." "Exactly. If wiring started the fire, the damage would spread differently." He tapped 3 different photographs. "This house burned in multiple places almost at the same time." Maria slowly looked up. So someone wanted this mansion destroyed." The realization settled heavily between them. 2 days later, Graham Foster arrived with 3 town inspectors. Each wore reflective safety jackets and carried clipboards. Graham smiled politely. "Routine inspection." Nolan crossed his arms. "We've only been here a week." "County regulations." The inspectors walked through the property, photographing cracked walls, damaged staircases, loose stones, and broken chimneys. When they finished, Graham handed Nolan a thick envelope. "Unfortunately, the structure violates numerous safety codes." Nolan opened the papers. More than 20 citations: roof instability, foundation concerns, unsafe entryways, fire hazards. Required repairs exceeded anything 2 elderly retirees could possibly complete within weeks. "You have 30 days, Graham said calmly, "or the county may order demolition." Maria stepped forward. "You knew this place looked like this when it was auctioned?" "That doesn't change public safety." Nolan looked directly at him. "Or private interests." For a brief second, Graham's pleasant expression disappeared. Then it returned. "I hope you reconsider my purchase offer." He turned and left. Maria watched the SUV disappear down the road. "He's not worried about safety." "No. He's worried about something else." That weekend, Nolan drove into town searching for affordable building supplies. Most stores quoted prices far beyond what they could afford. At one salvage yard, several men recognized him. "Hey, the $18 millionaire." Laughter followed. Another man shouted, "Planning to fix that haunted place with scrap wood." More laughter. Nolan quietly loaded several used hinges into his cart. He had spent too many years working around construction crews to let insults distract him. As he reached the register, someone stepped beside him. Emily Brooks, the local newspaper reporter. She introduced herself with a friendly handshake. "I've been hoping to meet you." "I've heard. I'd like to write a feature." "About what?" She smiled. "The elderly couple who bought the county's most famous ruin," Nolan answered politely. "If that's all you want to write, you'll waste your readers' time." Emily laughed. "I appreciate honesty." Later that afternoon, she visited Bellweather Mansion with a camera and notebook. Her first questions focused on the unusual purchase. "Were you trying to prove something?" "No." "Did you expect publicity?" "No." Did you think the property might contain treasure? Maria finally interrupted. Can I ask you something? Emily lowered her notebook. Of course. Why do you think Graham Foster wants us gone so badly? Emily hesitated. I haven't considered that. Maybe you should. Maria walked towards the burned library. Everyone thinks we're the story. She turned back. But perhaps the real story is why a powerful man keeps trying to buy something everyone insists is worthless. Emily stopped writing. For the first time since arriving, she looked beyond the burned walls. Not at the mansion, at the questions surrounding it. Later that evening, Tyler hurried toward the servants' wing, carrying a rolled-up map. I found something. He spread the map across the table. It showed proposed road expansions around Hollow Creek. A thick red line crossed several properties, then continued directly through Bellweather Mansion. Nolan stared silently. So Graham doesn't want the house? Tyler nodded. He wants the land. After Tyler left, Nolan decided to trace the mysterious copper cable he had noticed earlier. Digging carefully beside the eastern foundation, he uncovered several feet of tarnished wire disappearing beneath solid stone. It clearly hadn't supplied electricity to the mansion itself. Instead, it disappeared deep underground. He was about to continue when the smell of smoke reached him. Maria shouted from behind the house, "Nolan!" He ran toward her. Flames were consuming their carefully collected stack of salvaged lumber. Someone had poured accelerant across the wood. The fire spread too quickly to save most of it. Together they managed to prevent the flames from reaching the servants' wing. By the time the fire died, nearly every board Tyler had helped collect had turned to ash. Maria stared silently at the blackened remains. They want us to give up. Nolan wrapped an arm around her shoulders. We've already lost one home. He looked toward the dark silhouette of Bellweather Mansion standing beneath the evening sky. I'm not losing another. The smell of burned lumber lingered over Bellweather Mansion long after the flames had died. Nolan stood silently beside the blackened pile of timber that he and Tyler had spent days collecting. Every board represented hours of work they could not afford to lose. Someone had not merely destroyed wood. They had tried to destroy hope. Maria gently placed a hand on his shoulder. They're trying to make us leave. Nolan nodded. Then we're getting close to something. The words surprised even him. Only a week earlier, he would have accepted the loss as another cruel twist of fate. Now, however, every threat convinced him that Bellweather Mansion held a secret someone desperately wanted buried. The following evening, shortly after sunset, an old pickup truck rolled slowly through the broken gate. Walter Reed climbed out carrying a battered metal toolbox. He looked over his shoulder several times before approaching the servants' wing. I can't stay long, he said quietly. Maria invited him inside. The small room was warm from the wood stove, and for several moments Walter simply stared into the fire. Finally he spoke. I've carried this for 48 years. Nolan remained silent. He knew some confessions could only emerge when the speaker was ready. Walter took a slow breath. I was 27 when Bellweather Mansion burned. I had only been a volunteer firefighter for 6 months. His eyes drifted toward the window. The fire call came just after midnight. By the time we arrived, flames were already coming through the roof. Maria leaned forward. Were there people inside? Walter nodded. Eleanor Bellweather. And several families. The mansion wasn't empty. Nolan frowned. The newspaper said only Eleanor was living here. Walter shook his head. That wasn't true. She quietly let struggling families stay here. No one wanted the town to know. His voice became heavier. I remember hearing Eleanor scream. Walter closed his eyes. She kept shouting. There are people below. She wouldn't stop saying it. Nolan exchanged a glance with Maria. Below? Walter nodded. We thought she meant the basement. But before we could search, he paused, the fire chief suddenly ordered everyone away from the east side of the house. Why? He never explained. Walter's hands began trembling. I disobeyed for a moment. I ran behind the smoke. What I saw has haunted me ever since. The room became completely silent. There were 2 trucks parked behind the mansion. Several men were loading heavy metal containers into them, Maria whispered, during the fire. Walter nodded again. They weren't helping anyone. They were removing something. Nolan asked quietly. Did you recognize them? Walter lowered his head. One of them was Richard Foster, Graham Foster's father. Maria's breathing slowed. So Graham's family was here that night? Walter answered softly. Yes. I reported what I saw, but a week later my statement disappeared. My captain told me to forget everything. My father worked at Foster Industries. If I kept talking, he would lose his job. Walter looked ashamed. So I stayed silent. For nearly a minute, no one spoke. Maria finally reached across the table. You were afraid. Walter nodded. I've regretted that fear every day. Nolan placed a reassuring hand on the old man's arm. You still came. That matters. Walter opened the toolbox he had brought. Inside lay several faded photographs, newspaper clippings, and an old firefighter's notebook. I kept copies. I thought someday someone might ask. Nolan carefully examined the photographs. One image showed the eastern side of the mansion shortly after the fire. Unlike today, part of the foundation remained exposed. Another picture showed firefighters gathered near what looked like a large steel door before it disappeared beneath collapsed masonry. Nolan studied every detail. His years as an electrician had trained him to notice small inconsistencies. The fire damage still troubled him. He spread several photographs across the table. This wasn't one fire. Walter looked surprised. You can tell. Nolan nodded. These burn marks don't connect. He pointed toward 3 separate locations. The flames started here, and here, and here, almost simultaneously. Maria understood immediately. Someone set multiple fires. Exactly. A faulty electrical system couldn't produce this pattern. Walter slowly whispered, so Eleanor was telling the truth. The following morning, Emily Brooks arrived carrying a camera bag and several folders. I owe both of you an apology, she admitted before stepping inside. Maria smiled politely. For what? I came looking for a funny story. Emily placed several copied documents onto the table. Instead, I think I found something much bigger. She had spent 2 days searching county archives. The official fire report had indeed blamed aging electrical wiring. But another document caught her attention. 3 days after the original report, someone had filed a revised version. Several paragraphs had been replaced. Entire witness statements had disappeared. Even the estimated origin of the fire had changed. Emily looked at Nolan. Someone rewrote history. Nolan slowly folded the papers. They also knew enough about electricity to make the lie sound believable. Together, the 4 of them returned to the eastern foundation. Tyler soon joined them carrying shovels and measuring tools. Following the mysterious copper cable Nolan had discovered earlier, they carefully cleared decades of dirt and collapsed stone. After several hours, Tyler struck something solid. There's metal down here. Working patiently, they uncovered a rusted steel panel hidden behind fallen masonry. The copper cable disappeared directly into it. Nolan brushed away dirt from the surface. Several corroded switches remained visible. It's not part of the electrical system. What is it? Maria asked. Nolan examined the mechanism. He paused. I think this controlled something. Walter suddenly remembered the old photograph. The steel door. Everyone looked toward him. You think it's connected? Nolan nodded slowly. The cable carries very little electricity. Just enough to activate a release. Tyler pointed toward several thick iron pipes disappearing beneath the foundation. And these... water pressure. Nolan's eyes widened. This wasn't just wiring. It was a mechanical locking system. The realization excited all of them. Bellweather Mansion had possessed far more than an ordinary basement. It had been designed to protect something. Nolan carefully attempted to move one of the switches. Nothing happened. The mechanism refused to respond. He examined the center of the panel more closely. A circular opening sat where a brass component should have been. It's incomplete. Maria crouched beside him. Something's missing. That evening, she continued sorting through boxes recovered from the library. Inside an old photograph album, she discovered a portrait of Eleanor Bellweather, standing beside several children. Around Eleanor's neck hung an unusual brass pendant. Maria froze. The shape matched the empty opening inside the hidden control panel almost perfectly. She carried the photograph to Nolan. I think I found the missing piece. Before anyone could respond, Emily suddenly remembered something. I've seen that pendant. Everyone turned toward her. Where? Emily answered slowly. In Graham Foster's office. It hangs inside a display case with other family heirlooms. Silence filled the room. Nolan stared at the photograph. Maria stared at Emily. Walter's face drained of color. If Graham possessed the missing brass relay, then he had known about the hidden mechanism all along. The mansion had never been just another abandoned property. Someone had spent nearly 50 years making certain its greatest secret remained locked underground. The news that Graham Foster possessed the missing brass relay changed everything. Until that evening, Nolan and Maria believed they had accidentally stumbled into an old mystery. Now they understood something far more disturbing. Someone had been protecting that mystery for nearly half a century. Nolan barely slept. He sat beside the wood stove, studying the faded photograph of Eleanor Bellweather over and over. The brass pendant hanging around her neck fit the circular opening in the hidden control panel almost perfectly. Maria quietly poured him another cup of coffee. You've been staring at that picture for an hour. Nolan looked up. If Graham has the relay, then he knows what it's for. Maria nodded. And if he knows what's beneath this house. The following afternoon, a convoy of vehicles appeared at the front gate. 3 expensive SUVs rolled slowly across the gravel driveway. Tyler, who was repairing a damaged window frame, immediately climbed down from the ladder. Graham's back. This time, Graham did not arrive alone. 2 lawyers stepped out behind him. Another man carried a leather briefcase. Unlike his previous visit, Graham smiled broadly, almost confidently. I hope you've had time to reconsider. Nolan remained on the porch. We haven't. I expected that. Graham motioned toward the man holding their briefcase. He opened it. Inside lay neatly stacked bundles of cash alongside legal documents. I'm prepared to offer $50,000. Maria looked at Nolan in disbelief. Only a week earlier, Graham had offered $500. Now he had increased the price 100 times. Graham continued speaking smoothly. $50,000. Enough to buy a comfortable home. Enough to enjoy retirement. No more sleeping beside broken walls. No more worrying about winter. Maria stepped forward. You must want this land very badly. I simply dislike unfinished business. No. Maria met his eyes. You dislike losing control. For a brief moment, Graham's expression hardened. Then he laughed softly. I admire your determination. But determination won't repair this mansion, Nolan answered calmly. Neither will selling it. Graham closed the briefcase. I won't make this offer again. That's your choice. and keeping the property is yours." He turned toward the vehicles. As he reached the driver's door, he looked back one final time. "Not every battle can be won with stubbornness, Mr. Lane." After the SUVs disappeared, silence settled over the property. Tyler finally spoke. $50,000. I've never even seen that much money. Neither had Nolan. He walked slowly back into the servants' wing. Maria followed him. For several minutes, neither spoke. Finally, Nolan broke the silence. "What if he's right?" Maria looked at him. "What do you mean? We're living in one room. Winter is 6 weeks away. You've been coughing every morning." "If we accepted the money," Maria interrupted gently, "we'd be safe." "Yes. But would we be at peace?" Nolan sat heavily in an old chair. "I don't know anymore." For the first time since arriving at Bellweather Mansion, they disagreed. Nolan thought about warm walls, reliable heat, and a secure future. Maria thought about the hidden control panel, the stolen guest register pages, the burned lumber, and Graham's desperation. "People don't offer $50,000 for worthless land," she said. "They offer it because they're afraid." Nolan rubbed his forehead. "I'm afraid too." Maria knelt beside him. "So am I. But fear took our house once already. I'm not letting it take this one." That evening, Tyler returned after visiting his grandfather. His face looked unusually tense. "I heard something." Nolan looked up. "What happened?" "I stopped by Graham's office." "My grandfather was there?" Walter had been called to a private meeting. Tyler had waited outside. The office window had been slightly open. "I heard Graham threaten him." Maria frowned. "Threaten him how?" Tyler swallowed. "He said if Grandpa kept talking about the fire, people might start asking questions about his pension. And maybe about his property taxes. He said old men lose things when they remember too much." Maria's face hardened. "So Walter was right. They've been keeping him quiet for years." The next morning, Emily Brooks arrived carrying another folder. "I think I found what Graham really wants." She spread county property maps across the table. Nearly every parcel surrounding Bellweather Mansion had recently been purchased through shell companies, each company traced back to Graham Foster Development. Only one property interrupted the planned project: Bellweather Mansion. Emily pointed toward a thick red line on the map. "This is the proposed industrial access road. It can't be built unless Graham owns your land." Nolan studied the documents carefully. "So the mansion isn't standing in the way." The truth is, late that afternoon, an unfamiliar sedan slowly entered the driveway. Maria recognized it immediately. Daniel. Their son stepped out looking thinner than before. His expensive clothes had been replaced by inexpensive work boots and faded jeans. For several long moments, he simply stood beside the car, unsure whether to approach. Maria's emotions battled inside her. She had imagined this reunion countless times. None had prepared her for reality. Daniel finally walked forward. "Mom," her eyes filled with tears. Nolan remained standing inside the doorway. "Dad!" No answer came. Daniel lowered his head. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I just wanted to say I'm sorry." Nolan looked at him steadily. "Sorry for what, For everything." Maria invited Daniel inside. Over a simple dinner, he admitted that his construction business had completely collapsed. He had spent months moving from one temporary job to another. Every day he had wanted to call. Every day shame stopped him. "I ruined your lives." Maria quietly answered, "You broke our hearts." Daniel lowered his eyes. "I know." For a while the conversation seemed painfully honest. Then Nolan noticed something. Whenever Bellweather Mansion was mentioned, Daniel became unusually interested. Finally, he asked the question, "So, have you thought about selling?" The room fell silent. Nolan slowly put down his fork. Why would you ask that? Daniel hesitated. I just think, after everything you've been through, $50,000 could change your lives. Maria stared at him. How do you know the amount? Daniel froze. No one had mentioned Graham's latest offer. His mistake revealed everything. Nolan's voice became quiet. You've seen Graham? Daniel closed his eyes. He contacted me. He said if I convinced you to sell, he'd hire me as a consultant. Maria looked as though she had been struck. You came here for him. I came to apologize too. But yes, I needed the job. Daniel's shoulders slumped. He also told me something else. What? He knew about your foreclosure before the auction. He had people watching every abandoned property sale. He wanted to make sure nobody interested in Bellweather Mansion actually bought it. Nolan stood, slowly, without anger, without shouting. The disappointment in his eyes hurt Daniel far more than rage ever could. When we lost our house, I believed that was the worst day of my life. He paused. I was wrong. Daniel looked up. The worst day is realizing my own son still sees us as an opportunity instead of parents. Tears rolled down Daniel's face. I never wanted this, but you chose it. Maria quietly opened the front door. Daniel understood. He nodded once. I'm sorry. No one answered. He walked back toward his car alone. As darkness settled over Bellweather Mansion, strong wind swept across the valley. Near midnight, a loud crack echoed through the great hall. Nolan rushed outside carrying a flashlight. Several temporary support beams had collapsed. Fresh tool marks were visible where bolts had been deliberately loosened. Someone had sabotaged the structure. As broken timbers crashed onto the stone floor, decades of debris shifted beneath the impact. Dust filled the air. When it finally settled, Nolan noticed something unusual. Running beneath the collapsed section was a narrow stone channel lined with rusted iron wheels. It stretched directly toward the eastern foundation, toward the hidden control panel. Nolan knelt beside it. He smiled for the first time that day. They tried to bury it. Maria stood beside him. What is it? He brushed away another layer of dirt. The counterweight system. The basement. He looked toward the darkness beneath the mansion. Can still be opened. Rain arrived before dawn. By sunrise, Hollow Creek was trapped beneath the worst autumn storm anyone could remember that year. Sheets of water pounded the hillsides. The creek overflowed its banks and fallen branches blocked the only road leading to Bellweather Mansion. Inside the servants' wing, Nolan checked every repaired beam. So far, everything's holding. Maria added another log to the stove. We just need the roof to survive. Tyler hurried in from outside, soaked from head to toe. The bridge into town is underwater. So we're on our own. Nolan nodded. We've handled worse. Yet the storm refused to ease. Water poured through broken sections of the mansion, rushing across cracked stone floors before disappearing into narrow channels hidden beneath decades of debris. Nolan watched the flow carefully. That's strange. Maria looked over. What is? The water isn't pooling. It's being directed somewhere. Tyler crouched beside one of the channels. It all runs toward the Great Hall. The three of them followed the rushing water through the ruined mansion. Every small channel merged into larger stone gutters built beneath the original floor. Nolan suddenly remembered the rusted iron wheels they had uncovered the previous night. The counterweights. He looked upward. This entire roof was designed to collect rain. Tyler's eyes widened. You mean the storm is powering the mechanism? Not by electricity. By water pressure. Before anyone could respond, another vehicle struggled through the muddy driveway. Emily Brooks climbed out, carrying a waterproof case beneath her coat. I almost didn't make it. She hurried inside and immediately opened the case. I found something. Inside were several photographs. I attended a charity dinner at Graham Foster's house 2 years ago. I took pictures because I was covering the event. She spread them across the table. Most showed guests and decorations. One image captured part of Graham's office in the background. Hanging inside a glass display cabinet was the same brass pendant from Eleanor Bellweather's photograph. There it is, Maria whispered. Tyler stared silently at the picture. His face slowly turned pale. Emily noticed. Tyler. He hesitated. I need to tell you something. Everyone looked at him. I don't think that pendant is still there. Nolan frowned. What do you mean? Tyler swallowed hard. 3 nights ago. I went into Graham's office. Silence filled the room. Maria stared at him in disbelief. You what? I wasn't trying to steal. I just wanted proof. When everyone was distracted during a town meeting, I climbed through the window. Nolan's expression became serious. Tyler. The teenager reached inside his backpack. Carefully wrapped in an old towel lay the brass relay. I found it. I realized it matched the photograph. I knew Graham shouldn't have it. Maria covered her mouth. Emily looked stunned. You've had this all along. Tyler nodded miserably. I'm sorry. I thought you'd be angry. Nolan looked at the frightened teenager for several moments. You should never have risked that. I know. But if I hadn't... He held up the brass relay. We'd never open whatever's down there. Nolan sighed deeply. I can't approve of what you did. But right now, we have something more important to finish. The 4 of them carried the relay to the hidden control panel beneath the eastern foundation. Rainwater continued rushing through the underground stone channels. The rusted pipes vibrated faintly beneath the pressure. Nolan carefully cleaned the circular opening. The brass relay fit perfectly. With a gentle push, it locked into place. A sharp, metallic click echoed beneath the foundation. Tyler smiled nervously. Did it work? Partly. Nolan examined the surrounding wires. The electrical circuit still needs power. Emily looked around. There isn't any electricity. Nolan nodded. But there is a generator. Months earlier, he had salvaged a small, portable generator from an abandoned farm workshop. It barely produced enough electricity for lights. Hopefully, it would be enough. Together, they carried it beside the control panel. Nolan connected 2 temporary cables to the old copper line. He checked every connection twice, then looked toward Maria. If this fails, nothing happens. And if it works, Nolan smiled, we finally learn why everyone wanted this place. He pulled the starter cord. The generator sputtered, coughed, then roared to life. Power flowed into the ancient copper cable. For several seconds, nothing happened. Only the sound of rain filled the air. Tyler lowered his head. Maybe it's too damaged. Then came a deep, metallic thud. The ground trembled. Everyone froze. Another heavy sound echoed beneath their feet. Far below, enormous gears that had remained silent for nearly 5 decades began turning. Rust cracked. Stone groaned. Water surged through hidden pipes. The entire mansion seemed to breathe. Move! Nolan shouted. They hurried into the great hall. Dust poured from broken walls as ancient counterweights slowly descended inside hidden shafts. The scorched stone floor vibrated. A loud grinding noise echoed through the empty building. Then, inch by inch, 2 massive stone slabs separated. A narrow opening appeared. Cold air rose from below. Tyler whispered, "It's opening." The gap widened until an old staircase emerged from the darkness. Unlike the ruined mansion above, the steps looked almost untouched. Nolan switched on a flashlight. "We go together." No one argued. The staircase descended nearly 30 feet underground. The air felt cool and dry. At the bottom, another steel door stood partially open. Nolan pushed gently. Its hinges creaked. The room beyond stole everyone's breath. Nothing resembled an ordinary basement. Long hallways stretched beneath the mansion. Dormitory rooms lined one side. Shelves filled with canned food remained neatly arranged. Large water tanks occupied another chamber. A small medical clinic stood perfectly preserved behind thick steel doors. The fire had never reached this place. Maria slowly walked through the underground refuge. It was a shelter. Emily carefully photographed everything. This could have protected dozens of people. Tyler pointed toward another room. "There's more." They entered what appeared to be an archive. Hundreds of carefully labeled boxes covered metal shelves. Nolan opened the first. Inside were handwritten testimonies, letters, employment records, medical reports, statements signed by workers. Emily began reading aloud. "They forced us to dump chemicals into the creek." Another document. "My family was threatened after I reported contaminated wells." Another. "We were told the fire would erase everything." Her voice trembled. "This isn't treasure." Maria answered quietly. "It's evidence." On the far wall stood an old reel-to-reel recording machine connected to battery backups. Beside it lay a sealed envelope labeled, "If the basement is opened." Maria carefully unfolded the letter. Inside were instructions written in Eleanor Bellweather's handwriting. Beneath them rested a recorded message. Emily activated the machine. Static filled the room. A calm, elderly woman's voice echoed through the underground chamber. "My name is Eleanor Bellweather. If you are hearing this, the truth has finally found its way back into the light." She explained that powerful businessmen had buried evidence proving decades of environmental crimes and intimidation. Knowing her life was in danger, she had created a legal community land trust. If the crimes were ever exposed, Bellweather Mansion and surrounding properties would become protected, community land forever. Maria wiped tears from her eyes. "So she knew." Nolan nodded. "She prepared for this." Suddenly, another voice echoed from the staircase. "I was afraid you'd find it." Everyone turned. Graham Foster stood at the entrance. Behind him waited 4 large security guards. Rainwater dripped from their coats. Graham looked down at the archive. Then at Nolan. "You've seen enough." His calm smile had disappeared completely. "This basement belongs to me now." For several long seconds, no one moved. The underground chamber fell completely silent except for the distant rumble of the storm above. Graham Foster stood at the top of the stone steps with 4 security guards behind him, blocking the only visible exit. His expensive coat was soaked from the rain, but his expression remained cold and controlled. He slowly descended the staircase. His polished shoes echoed against the ancient stone. When he reached the archive room, his eyes swept across the shelves of neatly preserved boxes, the medical supplies, the old recording equipment, and finally the open envelope bearing Eleanor Bellweather's handwriting. "So," he said quietly, "you found it." Nolan stepped in front of Maria. "We found the truth." Graham gave a faint smile. "The truth depends on who tells the story." Maria folded Eleanor's letter and slipped it carefully inside her coat. "No, the truth survives, even when people try to bury it." One of Graham's lawyers moved toward the shelves. "These records belong to the Foster family." Emily immediately raised her camera. "They belong to history." She began photographing every shelf as quickly as possible. The rapid clicking of the camera echoed through the room. Graham looked at one of his guards. Take the camera. The guard stepped forward. Before he reached Emily, Maria stood directly in front of him. For a woman approaching 70, her voice carried surprising strength. You'll have to move me first. The guard hesitated. He clearly had no desire to shove an elderly woman. Graham's patience began to disappear. This archive contains private documents, Maria answered calmly. They describe poisoned water, threatened workers, burned homes. Those aren't private matters. They belong to every family that suffered. Graham took another step closer. You don't understand what you're interfering with. Nolan looked directly into his eyes. I understand enough. You've spent decades protecting lies. Emily quietly reached into her pocket and removed her phone. While everyone focused on the confrontation, she activated a live broadcast through the newspaper's emergency reporting application. The signal was weak because of the underground location, but portions of the video began uploading whenever reception briefly appeared. She slowly turned the phone toward the shelves, then toward Graham. She hoped even a few seconds would reach someone outside. Walter Reed suddenly appeared at the bottom of the staircase. Breathing heavily, he leaned against the wall. I came as fast as I could. His eyes immediately landed on several large steel containers stacked in a rear storage room. His face turned pale. I remember those. Everyone turned. Walter walked slowly toward the containers. His hands trembled as he brushed away decades of dust. I saw these the night of the fire. They were loading containers exactly like these onto trucks. Emily photographed the faded warning labels. Inside one partially damaged container remained sealed glass jars filled with soil samples. Attached reports listed chemical contamination levels from farmland surrounding Hollow Creek. Additional folders documented illegal dumping sites. Maria whispered, "This is why they burned the mansion." Walter nodded. Eleanor was collecting proof. Before anyone could continue, Graham lunged toward the recording machine. If these tapes disappear, none of this can be verified. He grabbed the reel recorder. Nolan reacted instantly. He intercepted Graham before the machine struck the floor. The heavy recorder slipped from Graham's hands, but landed safely against Nolan's chest. Emily quickly removed the magnetic recording reel. She hid it inside her camera bag. Graham realized too late. His evidence was no longer within reach. Outside thunder shook the foundation. The lights connected to Nolan's portable generator flickered. Tyler quietly slipped toward a narrow hallway branching away from the archive. Maria noticed. Where are you going? The ventilation passages. My grandfather showed them to me years ago. They lead outside. Nolan understood immediately. Get help. Tyler nodded once before disappearing into the darkness. One security guard noticed him. He's escaping. Graham raised a hand. Forget the boy. He won't get far in this storm. But Tyler already knew the narrow stone passages far better than anyone expected. Meanwhile, the confrontation inside the archive grew more dangerous. One guard attempted to force Maria away from the shelves. Nolan stepped between them. No one touches my wife. The guard shoved Nolan backward. He stumbled against one of the old cabinets. Several boxes crashed onto the floor. Hundreds of handwritten testimonies scattered across the stone. Workers describing contaminated wells, farmers describing poisoned livestock, parents describing children who became mysteriously ill. Every page represented another voice someone had tried to erase. Emily continued photographing everything. Her phone suddenly vibrated. Signal restored. Several minutes of live video uploaded automatically. She smiled quietly. Someone above ground was watching. Furious, Graham grabbed a heavy metal lantern from a nearby shelf. If I can't keep these records, no one will. He raised the lantern toward the archive. Before he could throw it, the floor beneath him shifted. One of the ancient counterweight mechanisms, weakened by age and activated after decades of inactivity, suddenly cracked. Stone exploded beneath Graham's feet. The edge of the floor collapsed into a deep, vertical shaft containing rusted chains and enormous iron weights. Graham lost his balance. He reached desperately for the air. His body slid toward the opening. One security guard tried to grab him but missed. Everything happened in seconds. Without thinking, Nolan lunged forward. He caught Graham's wrist just before he disappeared into the darkness. The force nearly pulled Nolan into the shaft as well. "Nolan!" Maria screamed. Walter and one of the guards immediately grabbed Nolan's shoulders. Together, they slowly pulled Graham back onto solid ground. Everyone stood frozen. Even Graham looked stunned. He stared at Nolan in disbelief. You saved me." Nolan breathed heavily. "I wasn't going to let another family lose someone." For the first time since they met, Graham could not find any words. His hatred had expected revenge. Instead, he received mercy. The silence was broken by Emily. While searching another cabinet, she discovered several sealed identity records. One document immediately caught her attention. It contained Eleanor Bellweather's photograph under a different legal name. "Eleanor didn't die," Maria hurried over. "What?" Emily continued reading. After escaping the fire, Eleanor had legally changed her identity with federal assistance while continuing to collect testimony from former workers. She had spent the last 12 years of her life traveling across several states, secretly documenting victims connected to Foster Industries. Walter slowly sat down. "She survived, and nobody knew." Emily nodded. "She wanted everyone to believe she was dead. It protected the investigation." Another folder contained addresses of dozens of witnesses. Many had long since passed away, but several names included updated contact information added only years before Eleanor's death. "They're still alive," Emily whispered. "They can testify." Suddenly, distant sirens echoed faintly through the ventilation passages. Everyone looked toward the staircase. Tyler had succeeded. Minutes later, state police officers entered the basement alongside county investigators. Their flashlights swept across the underground shelter. Boxes, documents, soil samples, medical records, recording equipment. Everything remained exactly where Eleanor had preserved it. One investigator looked toward Graham. "Mr. Foster, we're securing this entire site." Graham quickly regained his composure. "You have no warrant. My attorneys will have every document excluded." Another investigator calmly answered, "We're preserving evidence. The courts will decide the rest." Although Graham was not immediately placed under arrest, 2 officers remained beside him. His confidence had begun to crack. As investigators photographed every room, Nolan stood quietly beside Maria. She squeezed his hand. "We found it." He nodded. "No." He looked across the endless shelves filled with forgotten voices. "We found them." Above their heads, the storm slowly drifted away from Hollow Creek. For the first time in nearly 50 years, the hidden basement of Bellweather Mansion no longer belonged to silence. The storm had passed, but Hollow Creek awakened to a very different kind of turbulence. By sunrise, police vehicles surrounded Bellweather Mansion. County investigators erected temporary fencing around the property, while forensic teams carefully carried box after box of documents from the underground archive. Every item was photographed, labeled, and sealed before leaving the site. People gathered behind the barricades. Some came out of curiosity. Others came because they had lived with unanswered questions for nearly half a century. Emily Brooks stood outside broadcasting live reports. Authorities have confirmed the discovery of an extensive underground archive beneath Bellweather Mansion. Investigators describe the collection as one of the most significant historical evidence recoveries in county history. Behind her, cameras captured workers transporting the preserved records. No one laughed at Nolan and Maria anymore. By afternoon, news stations from Baltimore and neighboring counties had arrived. The story that began with an $18 auction had become national news. Inside a temporary command trailer, investigators spent hours examining Eleanor Bellweather's files. The evidence was overwhelming. Thousands of pages documented illegal dumping into local rivers, falsified environmental inspections, intimidation of whistleblowers, bribery of public officials, and secret payments made through companies controlled by the Foster family. Each document supported another. Dates matched, signatures matched, financial records matched. Nothing appeared accidental. One senior investigator quietly remarked, "Someone spent decades preparing this case." Emily overheard the comment. "No," she answered. "One woman spent decades making sure the truth survived." Meanwhile, Nolan and Maria remained inside the servants' wing. Despite the growing attention, they refused interviews until the investigation could proceed properly. Maria looked through the small window toward the crowd gathering outside. "Do you ever wish we'd never bought this place?" Nolan considered the question carefully. "If you'd asked me 2 weeks ago, I might have said yes." He smiled gently. "Now I think this house was waiting for someone." Maria laughed softly. "I suppose we answered." Later that afternoon, Walter Reed was asked to provide an official statement. This time no one interrupted him. No one told him to remain silent. He described arriving at the fire. He described Eleanor shouting that people were below. He described Richard Foster removing metal containers while the mansion burned. He described how his original testimony disappeared days later. When he finished speaking, the investigator turned off the recorder. "Mr. Reed, thank you." Walter lowered his eyes. "I should have spoken years ago." "You did." The investigator smiled kindly. "You simply weren't heard." Across town, Graham Foster sat inside his attorney's office. Stacks of legal documents covered the conference table. His lawyers reviewed warrants, search authorizations, and corporate records recovered overnight. One attorney finally broke the silence. "The situation is worse than we expected." Graham remained calm. "The documents prove nothing." "They prove enough to justify criminal proceedings." "The witnesses are dead." "Not all of them." The lawyer slid several pages across the table. "Eleanor Bellweather located surviving workers before she died. State investigators have already contacted them." For the first time, Graham looked uncertain. That evening, the county courthouse announced a special public hearing. Because of the extraordinary historical significance of the case, proceedings would begin immediately while the criminal investigation continued. The courtroom overflowed long before the hearing started. Residents filled every seat. Journalists lined the walls. Television cameras waited outside. Nolan and Maria quietly entered through a side hallway. Neither had ever imagined they would stand inside a courtroom because of an abandoned mansion. Emily sat nearby with her notebook. Walter occupied the front row. Tyler nervously watched from the public gallery. When Graham entered with his attorneys, whispers spread throughout the room. The judge called the hearing to order. "This proceeding concerns newly discovered evidence connected to Bellweather Mansion and related historical matters." One by one, investigators summarized the recovered materials: maps, photographs, environmental reports, financial ledgers, audio recordings, letters written by Eleanor Bellweather. Every presentation strengthened the previous one. Then came the recording. The courtroom fell silent as Eleanor's preserved voice echoed through the speakers. "My name is Eleanor Bellweather." If these words are being heard, then someone refused to let the truth remain buried. She described how company officials pressured inspectors to ignore contaminated water. She identified meetings, payments, and threats. She explained why she built the underground archive. Most importantly, she revealed the legal trust protecting Bellweather Mansion and surrounding land for community use if the evidence ever surfaced publicly. When the recording ended, even the reporters stopped writing for several moments. The silence carried more weight than applause ever could. Graham's lead attorney rose immediately. "We challenge the authenticity of these materials." The prosecutor calmly responded, Independent forensic analysis has already verified the paper ink audio tape and signatures. Another investigator added, several living witnesses have confirmed the events described. The defense objected repeatedly. Each objection weakened as additional evidence appeared. Finally, the prosecutor called Walter Reed. The elderly firefighter slowly approached the witness stand. His hand still trembled, but his voice remained steady. I saw Richard Foster removing evidence while the building burned. The defense attempted to challenge his memory. Mr. Reed, nearly 50 years have passed. Could you simply be mistaken? Walter looked toward Graham, then toward Nolan. I spent 50 years wishing I was. But memories like that don't disappear. Next came another surprise witness. An 83-year-old retired truck driver named Samuel Ortiz entered the courtroom using a cane. He testified that Richard Foster had hired him on the night of the fire to transport sealed containers away from Bellweather Mansion. I never knew what was inside. I only knew we weren't allowed to ask questions. His delivery records, preserved by Eleanor decades earlier, matched the dates exactly. The prosecutor rested the state's presentation. The judge turned toward Graham. Would you like to respond? Graham slowly stood. For years he had been the wealthiest and most influential man in Hollow Creek. Now every eye in the courtroom watched him for a different reason. My father made many decisions. I wasn't responsible. The prosecutor approached with another folder. We're not discussing only your father. She displayed recently recovered financial statements. Several shell companies purchasing land around Bellweather Mansion had been created under Graham's own signature. Additional emails documented attempts to acquire the property immediately after the auction. Another report detailed repeated code inspections requested by Graham's office despite no complaints from neighboring properties. The pattern became unmistakable. He had continued protecting the secret long after inheriting the family business. The judge reviewed the evidence carefully. After several minutes, she spoke. Based upon the evidence presented, the court finds sufficient cause to proceed with criminal charges relating to conspiracy obstruction of justice, evidence, suppression, environmental fraud, and witness intimidation. Gasps spread through the courtroom. Graham closed his eyes. Two state investigators quietly approached. One read the formal arrest warrant. Another placed handcuffs around Graham's wrists. No dramatic struggle followed. No angry speech. Only silence. As he passed Nolan, Graham stopped walking. You could have let me fall yesterday. Nolan met his eyes. I didn't save you from justice. I saved you for it. Graham lowered his head. For the first time in decades, he had no influence left to bargain with. After the hearing ended, reporters rushed toward Nolan and Maria. Questions came from every direction. How do you feel? Did you expect this? What will happen to the mansion? Nolan answered only once. We didn't come looking for headlines. We came looking for a place to begin again. Maria added quietly. Sometimes healing starts by uncovering what others tried to hide. That evening, as the sun set behind Bellweather Mansion, workers continued carrying the final evidence boxes from the underground archive. The mansion itself remained scarred by fire. Its walls still bore decades of damage. Yet for the first time in nearly 50 years, it no longer looked abandoned. It looked redeemed. 3 months passed before Bellweather Mansion became quiet again. The television crews disappeared. The satellite trucks rolled away. Court hearings continued in the state capitol, but Hollow Creek slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm. Winter arrived early. Snow settled across the hills, covering the burned grounds in a blanket of white. Yet inside Bellweather Mansion, something remarkable was happening. Construction crews worked alongside volunteers from dawn until dusk. Unlike previous renovation projects funded by wealthy developers, this one belonged to the community itself. Retired carpenters repaired beams. Former electricians replaced damaged wiring under Nolan's supervision. Local masons restored cracked fireplaces using the original stone whenever possible. Teachers organized food drives for the workers. High school students painted walls after classes. Even families who had once laughed at the elderly couple arrived carrying tools. Maria watched through a restored window one cold morning. "It's hard to believe this is the same town." Nolan smiled. "Maybe it always was. We just hadn't given people a reason to believe in themselves." The legal proceedings moved quickly. With thousands of authenticated documents, dozens of witness statements, and extensive environmental evidence, prosecutors built one of the strongest corruption cases in state history. Several former executives from Foster Industries accepted plea agreements. Others testified against higher-ranking officials. Large areas of contaminated farmland were officially designated for environmental restoration. Families whose wells had been poisoned decades earlier finally became eligible for compensation. For many residents, justice arrived painfully late. But it arrived. One snowy afternoon, Emily Brooks visited the mansion carrying the latest newspaper. The headline stretched across the front page. "State approves Bellweather Community Land Trust." She handed the paper to Maria. The court officially recognized Eleanor's trust. Maria smiled as she read. According to the ruling, Bellweather Mansion and the surrounding property would never again become private commercial land. Instead, it would remain permanently protected for education, emergency shelter, and community programs exactly as Eleanor Bellweather had intended. Nolan folded the newspaper carefully. "So she finally came home." Emily nodded. "In a way, yes." The restored underground shelter also attracted historians. Architects discovered that Eleanor had secretly modernized the basement years before the fire, using reinforced concrete independent ventilation systems, gravity-fed water storage, and emergency medical facilities. Experts described it as decades ahead of its time. Rather than hiding the underground chambers again, the community decided to preserve them. Future visitors would learn not only about corruption, but also about courage. One Saturday morning, Tyler Reed arrived before sunrise. He no longer looked like the uncertain teenager who had first appeared carrying old lumber. Months of working beside Nolan had transformed him. His confidence had grown with every repaired wall. He now carried his own toolbox. "What needs doing today?" he asked. Nolan handed him a set of blueprints. "You tell me." Tyler looked surprised. "I'm serious." "You've earned it." Together they inspected the western roof. Tyler explained how additional drainage would protect the restored structure for decades. Nolan listened carefully. When the young man finished, Nolan smiled proudly. "That's exactly what I would have suggested." Tyler laughed. "I guess I was paying attention." "You were doing more than that. You were learning." Later that afternoon, the county vocational school contacted Nolan with an unexpected offer. After hearing Tyler's story, they wanted to provide him with a full construction apprenticeship scholarship. When Tyler received the news, he could barely speak. "I've never won anything before." Nolan placed a hand on his shoulder. "You didn't win. You earned it." Across town, another important visitor quietly arrived. Daniel. This time he did not come in an expensive car. He walked through the snow carrying only a small cardboard box. Inside were family photographs rescued from a storage unit after his business collapsed. He stopped several feet from Nolan and Maria. "I know I have no right to ask for anything." Maria remained silent. Daniel held out the box. "I found these. I thought they belonged with you." Nolan slowly opened it. Inside lay photographs spanning 40 years. Birthday parties, Christmas mornings, camping trips. One picture showed a much younger Daniel helping his father repair a fence. Another showed Maria reading bedtime stories while Daniel slept beside her. The memories hurt. But they also reminded them that love had existed before greed. Daniel looked at the ground. "I've started meeting with a counselor. I've taken responsibility for the foreclosure." I'm selling everything I still own. The money will help repay part of what I caused. Maria quietly asked, "Why are you telling us this?" "Because I finally understand something." "What?" "I kept thinking success meant owning more." He looked toward Bellweather Mansion. "You lost everything. And somehow you built something's worth more than money." No immediate forgiveness followed. Some wounds required time. But before Daniel left, Maria hugged him. Briefly. Without words. It was not the end of healing. It was the beginning. By early spring, Bellweather Mansion looked almost unrecognizable. The burned exterior had been carefully preserved where possible as a reminder of its history. New roofs blended with restored stonework. The grand entrance reopened. The library welcomed donated books from across the state. Former guest rooms became temporary housing for families facing emergencies. The underground clinic was converted into a small museum explaining Eleanor Bellweather's investigation. School groups soon began scheduling educational visits. Children who had never heard of Bellweather Mansion now learned about integrity, environmental responsibility, and ordinary people choosing courage over fear. On the day of the official reopening, hundreds of residents gathered outside. Colorful banners hung across the entrance. A choir from the local high school sang as volunteers welcomed visitors inside. County officials delivered speeches. Historians praised Eleanor's legacy. Emily Brooks received an award for investigative journalism. Walter Reed was honored for finally telling the truth, despite decades of silence. When it came time for the ribbon-cutting ceremony, the mayor approached Nolan and Maria. "This belongs to you?" Nolan gently shook his head. "No. It belongs to everyone." He invited Tyler, Walter, Emily, several local children and families whose names had appeared inside Eleanor's guest register, to stand beside them. Together they held the ribbon. Together they cut it. Applause echoed across the front lawn. As visitors entered the restored mansion, many stopped before a bronze plaque placed beside the main entrance. It read, "Bellweather Community House, dedicated to Eleanor Bellweather, who preserved the truth. Dedicated to every family who refused to surrender hope. Dedicated to Nolan and Maria Lane, whose courage uncovered what history tried to bury." Maria quietly read the inscription. Tears filled her eyes. Nolan slipped his hand into hers. "We only bought a broken house." Maria smiled through her tears. "No." She looked around at laughing children, grateful neighbors' restored walls, and volunteers filling every room. "We found a family we never knew we had." As evening settled over Hollow Creek, warm lights glowed from every window of Bellweather Mansion. For the first time in half a century, the building no longer symbolized tragedy. It had become exactly what Eleanor Bellweather dreamed it could be. A place where strangers became neighbors, where forgotten voices were remembered, and where hope always found a door left open. 2 years later, Bellweather Community House had become the heart of Hollow Creek. Every morning began their same way. Children crossed the front lawn on their way to the reading room. Volunteers unloaded fresh produce for the community pantry. Retired teachers offered free tutoring in the restored library. Young tradespeople practiced carpentry, plumbing, and electrical work inside workshops created from the old carriage house. The burned mansion that no one had wanted for $18 now welcomed hundreds of people every week. Nolan Lane still woke before sunrise. Old habits never disappeared. He walked the property each morning with a steaming mug of coffee, checking fences, inspecting gutters, and making sure every light worked properly. He smiled every time he passed the bronze plaque near the entrance. Not because his own name appeared on it, but because Eleanor Bellweather's name came first. He believed that was exactly how she would have wanted it. Maria had become the unofficial keeper of the library. Shelves once filled with ashes now held thousands of donated books. Children crowded around her every Saturday afternoon for story hour. She knew nearly every child by name. Sometimes she paused while reading and looked around the room. The laughter echoed against the restored walls. It was difficult to imagine that the same building had once been abandoned, silent, and nearly forgotten. One spring afternoon, Emily Brooks returned, carrying the first printed copy of a newly published book. Its title read, "The House That Refused to Stay Silent." She handed the first copy to Nolan. "I dedicated it to everyone who chose courage over comfort." Nolan slowly turned to the first page. The dedication read, "For Eleanor Bellweather, for Walter Reed, for every worker who spoke the truth, and for two people who believed an abandoned house deserved one more chance." Maria smiled. "You've made all of us sound much braver than we felt." Emily laughed. "The brave ones are usually the people who are afraid. They simply keep walking anyway." The book quickly found readers across the country. Universities invited Emily to speak about investigative journalism. Environmental organizations used Bellweather Mansion as a case study, showing how ordinary citizens could preserve historical evidence. Law schools discussed Eleanor Bellweather's trust as an extraordinary example of long-term legal planning. Hollow Creek was no longer known for scandal. It became known for resilience. The legal consequences continued reaching far beyond the town. The remaining executives connected to the old Foster network received prison sentences. Several government officials lost their positions after corruption investigations expanded. Millions of dollars were directed toward restoring damaged streams and farmland. Although nothing could erase decades of suffering, future generations would inherit cleaner water than the previous ones. Graham Foster remained in prison awaiting the conclusion of additional appeals. One quiet afternoon, Nolan received an unexpected letter. The return address listed the state correctional facility. Maria looked at the envelope. "You don't have to read it." Nolan opened it anyway. Inside, Graham had written only one page. He admitted that he had spent most of his life protecting a family name instead of protecting innocent people. He confessed that the moment Nolan pulled him away from the collapsing shaft had haunted him every day. One sentence remained in Nolan's thoughts long after he finished reading. "You gave me mercy when I earned justice. I still don't understand why." Maria quietly folded the letter. "Will you answer?" Nolan looked toward the window. Children were planting flowers beside the front walkway. After a long silence, he nodded. "Yes." "What will you say?" He smiled gently. "I'll tell him something I finally learned myself." That evening, he wrote a short reply. He thanked Graham for accepting responsibility. He encouraged him to continue telling investigators everything he knew, and he ended with a single sentence. "The truth cannot change yesterday, but it can protect tomorrow." Weeks later, another surprise arrived. Daniel returned once again. This visit felt different from every previous one. He no longer carried guilt like a shield. Instead, he carried tools. "I heard the youth workshop needs volunteers." Nolan looked at him carefully. "It does. I was hoping, if you'll allow it. I'd like to teach basic construction." No immediate answer came. Instead, Nolan handed him a damaged wooden chair. "Repair that first." Daniel smiled nervously. "I remember. Years earlier, his father had taught him the same lesson. Respect the work before asking for responsibility. By sunset, the chair stood sturdy again. Not perfect, but honest." Nolan ran his hand across the smooth wood. "You still remember how?" Daniel nodded. "I never forgot." Little by little, trust returned. Not because anyone pretended the past had never happened, but because everyone chose to build something better than it. During the annual community celebration that summer, hundreds of families gathered on the mansion lawn. Children played beneath enormous oak trees. Local musicians performed on a small outdoor stage. Food trucks lined the gravel road. Walter Reed, now noticeably slower but smiling more than ever before, watched everything from a rocking chair placed beneath the porch. Tyler, now a certified apprentice carpenter, supervised younger students building picnic tables for nearby parks. Emily interviewed visitors from several states who had traveled simply to see the famous mansion. As evening approached, the mayor stepped onto the stage. "I have one final announcement." The crowd gradually became quiet. "The State Historical Commission has officially designated Bellweather Community House as a protected historic landmark." Thunderous applause erupted. The mayor continued, "But buildings alone don't preserve history. People do." He invited Nolan and Maria onto the stage. Neither enjoyed public attention, yet both accepted with quiet humility. The mayor handed them a framed certificate. "You reminded all of us that value is not determined by appearance. Sometimes the places everyone abandons are the places that need us most." Nolan looked across the crowd. He saw children laughing, neighbors embracing, former strangers working side by side. He thought back to the auction, the laughter, the insults, the $18 that almost everyone considered worthless. When the applause faded, he spoke only briefly. "I spent most of my life fixing electrical systems. I believed broken things simply needed enough skill and enough time." He paused. "Then I lost my home. I thought some things couldn't be repaired." He looked toward Maria. "I was wrong." He turned toward the mansion behind him. "This building wasn't saved because two old people were stubborn. It was saved because one woman protected the truth. Because one firefighter finally found the courage to speak. Because one young reporter refused to stop asking questions. Because one teenager believed an old house deserved another chance. And because an entire town decided that its future mattered more than its pride." He smiled warmly. "Every community has a Bellweather Mansion. It may not be a burned building. It may be a forgotten neighbor, a lonely child, an elderly veteran, a struggling family, something everyone else walks past. The question isn't whether those places exist. The question is whether we'll stop long enough to rebuild them." Silence settled across the lawn. Then the applause returned louder than before. As darkness gently covered Hollow Creek, lights illuminated every window of Bellweather Community House. From a distance, the restored mansion shone like a beacon across the valley. No one remembered it anymore, as the burned mansion sold for $18. They remembered it as the place where buried truth found daylight, where forgiveness proved stronger than revenge, where one elderly couple lost everything they owned and discovered something infinitely greater. They found a purpose that could never be auctioned away.